Two Men Talk Music. Thanks for joining us. And the first installment, we're going to be talking about Sabbath, specifically two particular years of Sabbath, 1980, 1981. So essentially, we're talking about the Dio years. And I'll just quickly say the reason for that really is that I didn't really know much about this period of Black Sabbath. It's a period that I think the Sabbath purists maybe don't really approve of it because it's seen as being very different to the Aussie years, I suppose. Ronnie James Dio, very different kind of singer. So I had this awareness in my mind that there was this second era of Sabbath, which was maybe not universally liked, and I just didn't know the music at all. So I figured it would be, quite an interesting topic to do. How about you?
Well, I've not heard any of it, so this is all new to me. I'm only familiar with the earlier Black Sabbath, for reasons we might talk about later. But in terms of that period, no, it was a whole new listen.
I've got this memory of being a kid. I was probably about 10 or 12, and I went to the house of my cousin, who had a really good record collection. He was about 16 at the time. And I remember going into his room and looking through his records, and he had this album in his collection, Heaven and Hell. And I just remember looking at the cover and thinking, what a really cool cover that is, all these angels smoking. And it's
It's
amazing
quite
because,
good.
yeah, I mean, I'm now at the age of, what am I now, 52 or something, and I've only just heard this album. It's taken me decades to listen to it.
Right.
And I guess looking at the record, that was always my enduring image of what I kind of thought Black Sabbath was, because I suppose the name Black Sabbath has a certain connotation to it, doesn't it? It's that kind of
Yeah.
profane thing. And just this image of the angels smoking cigarettes, I just remember looking at it and thinking, oh yeah, that's a really cool kind of look.
They're one of those bands, aren't they? They've been around for so long.
Yeah.
It depends on where you came into them. Probably dictates quite a lot on what you think about them. So I
Mm,
imagine some people, those Dio albums might be the first thing they ever heard, and
mm.
actually when they go back to the original albums, probably didn't like them.
One interesting thing to consider is what was happening in music when these albums came out, because Heaven and Hell came out 18th of April 1980. So the new wave of British heavy metal was already in full swing. Are you aware of what that is and how that fits into the whole picture?
Give me a few names. Is that
Well,
like,
the really big bands from that movement were Motorhead, Iron Maiden,
Iron Maiden, yeah. Def
Sax,
Leppard?
Def Leppard,
Yeah.
Saxon, and there was
Uh-huh.
a particular sound that they all had, because it sort
Mm,
of came up at the same time as punk, but it
mm,
wasn't punk. It was a very different thing to punk, really, but it still had that slightly kind of ragged, quite fast, quite adrenaline-y kind of sound. And
mm,
Heaven and Hell, it's sort of got that sound, really. It is quite different to the early Sabbath. It's less doomy,
mm,
isn't it? It's less
mhm.
apocalyptic. It sounds more like something which is a little bit punked up, maybe, or a little bit more aimed at younger people. Going back to what you were saying, maybe some of the older Sabbath fans were starting to get a bit long in the tooth, and they'd gone through all
Mm.
this, all the Aussie years, all those big albums, and then there's this sort of new market for younger bands coming up, and maybe Heaven and Hell sort of hitched a ride on that a little bit. It seemed to be a different sort of music altogether, didn't it?
Yeah, it's a lot glossier than the early stuff in
Mm.
terms of the production. I did a little bit of research on the producer. He's
Martin
worked with,
Birch.
yeah, Fleetwood Mac, Deep Purple, Wishbone Ash, White
Mm.
Snake, Iron
But
Maiden, all that stuff, isn't it? Very similar sounding sort of rock music.
yeah, I was just going to say Iron Maiden is the really significant one because he'd
Mm.
worked on, I think it was the Killers album, and Martin Birch did go on to be a very prominent metal producer, I think. But
Mm.
the album, it's interesting. The album apparently didn't have a huge budget because Sabbath, their sales had been falling. I mean, I've got some stats here. I don't know how interesting it is, but there's this sort of thing where bands who become very important over the years, and so they're
Mhm.
looked back on as being the great legendary Black Sabbath, but at the time, they weren't a particularly huge band in the
No.
1970s. They had a sort of brief window where they were really big. But just listen to some of these chart positions. If we go back to Sabotage, which is maybe five or six albums in, got to 28 in the US. And then the next one, Technical Ecstasy, got to 51 in the US, which
Mm.
is piss poor, really, isn't it? Then Never Say Die, which is the last album that Ozzy was on, got to 69 in
Wow.
America.
Yeah.
And then Heaven and Hell then got to 28 in America.
Hmm.
So there was a definite kind of jump up. So it did seem to reinvigorate them a little bit, and it seemed to kickstart them a little bit.
Well, it's interesting because it's a much more commercial sound, isn't it,
Yeah.
than the early stuff. So it sounds like very much they're going for the American market. Is he American, the producer, by the way? Is he?
Martin Birch.
Oh no, he's British. Sorry,
I
no,
don't
he's
think
British.
so.
Yeah,
But
yeah,
Dio was American. I mean, this is the crucial thing
yeah,
we have to kind of
yeah.
realize. Ronnie James Dio, I mean, how aware of him were you? I mean, did you have much knowledge of him or awareness of him as a person or as a
No, nothing. I mean, that's that sort of music.
yeah.
It's just like a complete anathema to me. It really is.
Okay.
That whole rock scene is just, yeah, that was kind of everything I hated
Are you saying that
in the 80s.
are you saying that the Aussie Sabbath is not the opposite of your music taste, but the Dio stuff is? Is that what you mean?
Yes, yes,
Okay.
pretty much, yeah.
Okay.
Um,
Okay.
and yeah, it's just the sort of stuff I'd never listen to ever.
Yeah. So how would you characterize the difference then between Aussie, the Aussie style and the Dio style? Because they are very different.
Um, well, yeah, let's go back a bit into the history then, I guess.
Hmm.
So, well, from my perspective, I mean, I never really I'm from the Midlands, right? From Stafford, so I'm right from the sort of West Midlands area, sorry. And obviously that's where sort of Black Sabbath came from. So for me, they're a band that are always there. They're very synonymous with that part of the country.
Hmm.
So as someone from there, it's sort of in your blood, if you know what I mean. Whether you like them or not, it's kind of it's almost like a rite of passage, really, is the Black Sabbath thing. So, and obviously, my background is not dissimilar to theirs. You know, my dad worked in a factory.
Yeah.
He didn't have much of an education, no qualifications, and worked as a sheet metal worker actually as well.
He
So
didn't chop his fingers off,
he
did he?
didn't chop his fingers off, thankfully. No,
Right.
no. So coming from that, I grew up with like, in that sort of, surrounded by power stations and the miners' strike and all that kind of stuff. So that early stuff really kind of, even though it's not particularly my kind of cup of tea, if you like, I can actually relate to it quite well.
Hmm.
And obviously, it's got all the influences from sort of folk and blues and that kind of thing. But it's kind of married, isn't it? In that kind of, they talked about sort of the industry of the West Midlands, the sound and the noise and that heaviness,
Yeah.
which you really get from those sort of early albums. And
Hmm.
that's kind of what it means to be really. When I listen to it, I can kind of really feel that, even though like some of the stuff's really good, some of it doesn't really kind of
Hmm.
um so sort of, what's the word,
Resonate?
yeah, resonate with me. Thank you. But I can still, it's kind of more about that feeling, isn't it? That kind of urge to get out.
Hmm.
A lot of people in that kind of time of period, just wanted to get out, didn't they?
Hmm.
University wasn't open to them. There was nothing but working in a factory for the rest of their lives. So it's like you can sort of hear that kind of, it's got a weird sense of like anger
Hmm.
and but sort of operatic dramatics as well. Like kind of hammer horror. I wrote down hammer horror hippies as my notes there to
Well, I
describe
mean,
it early. Yeah.
do you know the story of Geezer Butler, the bass player? He had a terrifying encounter with Satan in his younger days. This is
Right. Yeah.
sort of how the Sabbath thing came about. He was messing about with incantations, I think, and he had some kind of
Mm,
terrifying vision. But I think it was Ozzy, wasn't it, who said he said that they'd sort of hit on this idea of people like going to see scary movies, so why wouldn't they like scary music? It was just one of those
mm,
kind of just one of those ideas, I suppose. It just falls from the heavens, this idea of doing scary horror music. And when they first started doing it around the clubs in the Midlands, people were just absolutely like, what the fuck is this? It went down very, very badly
mm,
amongst the sort of, the kind of general punters.
mm,
I mean, Tony Iommi is interesting because he was really a sort of blues guitarist, really. They came out of the blues scene. But obviously what
mm,
happened is he chopped his fingers off, or the tops of his fingers
mm,
off in this in this accident. and he had to totally relearn the guitar, and he couldn't play any
Mm.
of the stuff that he'd learned to play already. He had to literally start again. He
Mm.
had no sense of touch in his fingers, so he couldn't feel the strings when he was playing. So he couldn't tell how far to bend the strings because he had no sensation. So he
Mm.
learned to play this style of guitar, which was totally
Mm.
unique and was. I mean, he detuned the strings, didn't he? Played
Mm.
in
That's right.
drop tuning, so everything's very kind of low and very, very powerful. I mean, you mentioned the working class thing, which is definitely in there. You know, the factories and that kind of
Mm.
urban realism. But I hear a lot of sort of the Blitz in Black Sabbath's early music. There's this kind of there's tracks where you
Yeah.
can almost hear the air raid sirens. In fact, I'm sure there is
Mm.
a track, isn't there, where there's an air raid siren just in the background, just really kind of dark.
Probably.
Yeah, and it's just
Like War
tracks like
Pigs. Yeah.
yeah, I think it's War Pigs, isn't it?
Yeah.
And tracks like Iron Man, they've got such
Mm.
a sense of menace to them, I suppose, haven't they? This kind of
Mm.
sense of reality, this
Mm.
scary, dark thing. And I guess we should talk about Ozzy's singing style because
Mm.
what do you make of Ozzy's contribution to the original Sabbath? Because he's definitely got his own sound, isn't he? Which maybe
Oh,
Dio.
yeah.
Well, we can talk about Dio in a minute.
Yeah. I know, I really like his voice, always have done.
Mm,
It's just so distinctive, isn't it? I mean, you can't really,
mm,
you wouldn't think anyone else, would you, when you hear his voice? I mean, one of the thing actually, interestingly, one of the comments I made about comparing them is that um, Dio, I found his vocals sound exactly the same on every track.
mm,
There is no distinction from one track to the other in his singing, whereas
mm,
Ozzy has a different sort of character for each song.
mm.
Because like in from their point of view, I think each song is like this little kind of play, isn't it? Almost a little bit of theatre. Whereas the Heaven and Hell album, Mob Rules isn't so bad, but Heaven and Hell in particular, I think, was quite hard to distinguish one from the other in my ears, anyway.
Are you aware of the difference in the creative procedure that they had between the Aussie years and the Dio years?
No.
Because
Mm.
okay, so what it is this, right? In the original Aussie incarnation of the band, Ozzy didn't write the lyrics. So
Right.
what would happen is they would jam. Ozzy would kind of just wail and sing just meaningless sounds in order to establish what the vocal line was going to be.
Mm.
And then Geezer Butler, the bass player, then would go away and write the lyrics based on Ozzy's scat
Right.
singing.
Mhm.
So Ozzy ended up singing the words which were not his, but he was singing his own vocal melodies.
Yeah.
And what he would do, he would sing essentially the same tune as the riff.
Mm.
So Tony would play a guitar riff, and Ozzy would just literally, really just sing that over the top
Mm.
of it. So you've got this weird situation where the singer is basically singing the same thing as what the guitar is doing,
Yeah.
and then the bass player then provides the words.
Yeah.
So it's really fucked up. It's really strange.
Mm.
But then what happened in the Dio years totally different. So for a start, Dio wrote all the words, I think
Yeah.
anyway. So he basically supplanted Geezer Butler as the lyricist. He came in with his own
Mm.
definite thing, like I am the lyric writer, and he did the opposite musically to what Ozzy had done. So he would sing across the riff. So Tony Iommi would come up with the guitar riff, and rather than singing along with it, Dio would sing a different melody over the top.
Right.
And it was that Tony Iommi really responded to and was quite excited
Mhm.
by. I think he thought, "Wow, this is a different way of doing it. We're going to have a
Someone who can someone who can sing.
yeah, basically somebody who can not only sing but someone who can write as well." So say what you like
Mm.
about Dio, I totally agree with what you're saying. That he's
Mm.
much more kind of generic, isn't he? He's got this
Mm.
very sort of masculine voice, but I think he did bring a new influx of creativity into the band that maybe Ozzy. Have you heard what Dio has said about Ozzy? This is quite an interesting strand to the whole story. You know,
No, go on.
well, I think Ozzy always slagged him off, obviously, because he kind
Mm.
of, replaced him in the band. But I mean, Dio was no time for Ozzy at all. He called him an animal and said he was totally without any artistic merit, any kind of
Right.
creativity. He totally dismissed him, completely
That's
and
very hard.
utterly. Yeah, but I think you're right. I think on this album and on Mob Rules as well,
Mm.
Dio's he's got this very masculine sound, hasn't he? It's this
Mm.
he was really into opera when he was growing up.
Right.
And you can definitely hear that, can't you? There's a kind of operatic quality to his voice. Now, I've never
Yeah.
responded well to that. I've never
Yeah.
liked Bruce Dickinson in Iron Maiden, that kind of
Mm.
warbling
Yeah.
from the
Yeah. Yeah.
chest kind of singing, isn't it? Is that what you
Mm.
also don't like? That kind of
Oh yeah. Yeah.
standard
Yeah.
issue sort of American
Yeah. Yeah.
rock caterwauling, isn't it?
It is. Yeah. Yeah. Um, yeah. It's just a style of singing I just don't, sort of get along with at all, really.
Hmm.
Even to this day, when you hear some pop stars and stuff just wailing stuff out, at you, it's just like, oh my god, turn it
Hmm.
off.
But the thing is, though, I mean, to be fair, if you look at the songs on this album, they are quite punchy, well-written songs. I mean, "Children of the Sea" is the first song which apparently they wrote together, and it does have a very composed melody. It's not just some guy shrieking and roaring. That I
Mm,
mean, they are sort of pop songs in a way. I mean, they've got this sort of metallic thing going on, but they're very. I think you said it already. Quite sort of radio friendly, aren't they? They do sound like they're trying to write
mm,
something which is quite immediate, quite tuneful.
yeah.
I don't
But
think it's
that
go
radio
on.
thing's quite interesting because there's a lot of mid-range in those albums. And that's a very sort of 80s kind of sound, really. It's like it's all in the mid level. There's no bass. There's a bit of high, but it's certainly most of the production sort of centered around the middle area, which is where it comes out of the radio.
Hmm.
Radios obviously in those days are very tinny affairs. And you compare that to the earlier stuff, which is like playing in unison. We talk about the vocals, but also I never really heard that before. But a bit of research about them, the guitars and the bass playing this pretty much the same riff.
All right.
So you've got like the guitar and the bass, and then the drums, and obviously his vocal almost playing the same sort of melody for each song.
Hmm.
So it just gives this whole very heavy kind of production to it, doesn't it? It's very heavy sound,
Hmm.
um, which yeah, maybe just didn't come across in maybe that sort of accounted for their sort of lack of sales. Maybe didn't sound very good on the radio. Whereas um, the yeah, sort of the later productions definitely would sound, sort of
Hmm.
come out the speakers, especially at that sort of time as well. I mean, the
Hmm.
early 80s is when the synth pop stuff started to kick off, isn't it?
Hmm.
So you have a lot of synth bands, Depeche Mode and Duran Duran and Soft Cell, Human League, having really big hits. So I
Hmm.
suppose that would have sounded really different at the time.
Hmm.
Certainly on the radio, would
Hmm.
have sounded very quite in your face, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, all sorts of bands had to change, didn't they? I mean, Queen totally retooled themselves for the 80s. Everybody had to do it. One quite funny thing we haven't touched on is is what was happening within the band during the
Mm.
transition, and maybe their reason for wanting to get their act together, musically, was
Mm.
that they had basically hit the skids. I mean, you've got
Was this Oz's pizza and whiskey period?
well, they were all big cokeheads. They were all snorting coke
Mm.
by the mid 1970s. They were just totally wasted, really. They
Mm.
did so. They did. Let's have a look and see what we can find here. They did this album, which is Technical Ecstasy, which is
Right.
this is the one where they really started to come unstuck. They're kind of
Mm.
the sound isn't very good. It was a self-produced record. They were all just wasted in the studio and they couldn't really
Mm.
sort of get it together. And then they were even in a worse state with the final Aussie album, which was Never Say Die, which did have a big hit single on it. But again, the band were basically just falling apart at the seams.
Mm.
And very, very unhealthy atmosphere in the studio. Everybody just taking drugs and just wasted. And then they booted Ozzy out because he was just not capable of doing it anymore, and he didn't really like the direction they were going in anyway. So you're talking about a situation really where a band has kind of reached the end of the road. It's interesting that they
Yeah.
could have just broken up at that point. And in fact, Heaven and Hell, I don't think the original intention really was for it to be a Black Sabbath album. I think
Mm.
Tony Iommi had heard Dio. The original plan had been for the band to be called Heaven and Hell, which is
Right.
what
Okay.
which is what they ended up calling the album. But the record company wanted it to be Sabbath. Um, but are you aware of what happened? prior to this with Rainbow, because I don't think you can have a discussion of Dio era Sabbath really without talking about Rainbow, because Rainbow was the band that he was in before
Mm.
Sabbath. So
Again,
that
no,
will
it's not. It's not a. Yeah.
well, Ronnie James Dio's band Elf
Right.
is supporting Deep Purple. Deep
Right.
Purple. So Deep
Hmm.
Purple was the band that Richie Blackmore was in originally.
Hmm.
And Richie Blackmore hears Ronnie James Dio singing with this band Elf and decides he wants to form a band with him instead. So he forms this band called Rainbow with Ronnie James Dio
Hmm.
using the musicians that were in Elf. Then he sacks all the people that were in Elf apart from Dio, and they do this album called Rainbow Rising together. So this is Dio,
Mm.
Richie Blackmore, and this is the new version of Rainbow. And this is where Dio's vocal style that you hear on Heaven and Hell really starts to sort of, come into its own. But Rainbow's music is nothing like Black Sabbath. Rainbow's music is kind of, it's very operatic, it's very
Mhm.
classical, and quite sort of medieval as well. It's just
Right.
a bit progressive and just not really anything like what Sabbath were doing at the time. Ronnie
Mhm.
James Dio leaves the band and ends up working with Tony Iommi. They decide to get a band together called Heaven and Hell. Where's it gone?
But turns into Black Sabbath.
And then it sort of accidentally turns into Black Sabbath. So that is the backstory. Very
Mm.
confusing. I got very confused telling that story. I'm going to have to do
Mm.
a lot of editing when I go back to doing that.
Rock family trees.
Yeah, I mean that is the one aspect of all this that I do find very interesting. That listening to Sabbath music, even as late as 1980, you do get this kind of sense of a backstory and
Mm.
it's just a sense of this incredible tangled history, which is
Mm.
coming to fruition in this pair of albums, Heaven and Hell. Where are the stats here that we've got? 1980, 18th of April 1980, and then Mob Rules comes out in November 81, and then it all completely falls apart. Dio leaves the
Mm.
band,
So what
and
happened then? It's just
well, then it gets really mad then, because then they get in Ian Gillan, who was the original
right.
singer in Deep Purple, and they make this album called Born Again in 1983, which is a really strange album. It's like a mixture of Black Sabbath and again, that album is not meant to be Black Sabbath. It's meant to be
Mm.
something else, and the record company again insists that they call it Black Sabbath. So Sabbath goes from being this very distinctive band and it turns
Mm.
into this kind of brand which is just endlessly
Yes.
changing and morphing and turning into something different. And Tony Iommi is kind of getting dragged along. Really, you get the sense that he loses control over it.
Mm.
Really, in a commercial sense, and he's just basically doing what the record company tells him, and
Mm.
it's just one of them.
Yeah.
So where does that leave us then? I mean, I was surprised listening to these records, listening to Heaven and Hell and Mob Rules, because I did actually enjoy them both.
I did not. There was one track on Mob Rules called Sign of the Southern Cross, which I
Yes.
said starts well and then he sings. And E5150, which is quite good because there's no singing on it. I'm not a fan of his voice, to be fair.
So
Uh,
essentially, it's Dio
yeah,
that trips you
I
up.
wrote, I wrote, I wrote on Die Young from Heaven and Hell. Literally the worst thing about rock music.
Which is what?
Just that record. That's just that track. I think is if you could distill everything I dislike about a particular style of rock music, that is it. I think, to be honest.
Yeah.
So
So
yeah.
what are these elements that you're finding yourself deeply repelled by? What are the ingredients that you think, right,
Oh,
this is what I
it's
don't like,
it's hard to say really. It's just like it's almost like a deep sort of sense of just of just like I just don't want to listen to that. I don't know what it is, to be honest. My musical background could go sort of in the 80s. I didn't get into sort of guitar music until very late in the 80s via sort of Pixies and Sonic Youth and that kind of noise American stuff. So all the sort of everything before that, sort of all the 80s rock,
Mm,
I just couldn't deal with it at all, really. It's
mm,
just that sound, sometimes you just get a sound which just doesn't,
mm,
relate to you at all. And it's very hard to kind of get over that.
mm.
So sometimes you can kind of go back and listen to, I listen to, a lot of prog rock and stuff I used to hate before, I really like it now. So sometimes these things sort of come back, don't they?
Mm.
But I've never got into that stuff at all. It's very hard for me to kind of listen to it and kind of go, that's good.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I've got a slightly different trajectory, and I was into, a bit of heavy rock when I was a teenager. So the Dio stuff in Sabbath, it doesn't turn me off really. It doesn't sort of
Mm,
set my teeth on edge. I think if his if the operaticness of his voice was dialed up maybe a little bit more than it is, I
mm,
would probably have a similar reaction to you. For me, it's just on the right side of acceptable. And I think because the tunes and the melodies on both those albums I think they're quite well composed. It's not just a load of hot air. I can
mm,
hear how the guitar riffs are still, I think they're still being quite a creative band, and the music is just, it seems to hang together for me. I think it's decent. It's not as interesting as classic Sabbath, but I do
mm.
think it's kind of interesting.
There's a certain sort of style of music you don't like. I think it's a bit kind of mean, I guess, just to kind of slag it off all the time, because obviously it means a lot to some people. A lot of people really like it. So who am I to say, what's good or bad? But I think if it wasn't, like I say, if they weren't Black Sabbath albums, then yeah, that's fair game. But I think because they're sort of touted as Black Sabbath albums, I suppose you could be a little bit more critical about them.
Mm.
Because then obviously what you do is compare them to the other albums, and if they're sort of very different beasts, then I suppose it's kind of fair enough to kind of go, okay, this is good, this isn't very good.
I think taken in context, I think Heaven and Hell and Mob Rules, they were big successful albums. They were radio
Mm,
friendly. They had some good writing on, good production. I do think Dio is good for what he was. I know he's not to your taste. It's
mm.
not quite to my taste either, but I can definitely get along with it. I bought the CD, uh, having streamed it, I decided that I liked it enough to buy it. So I guess we'll just have to sort of part company really in a fundamental sense with that one.
Yeah,
So,
yeah,
but
yeah.
that's interesting. That's interesting.
Mm.
I'm sure as these videos go on, we'll be agreeing to disagree on various things, won't we?
Oh, I'm sure. Half the fun, isn't it?
So, do you have anything left to say, or should we wrap things
No,
up?
that's it really, I think.
Right. Well, yeah. Viewers, hope you enjoyed it. Leave some comments. If you enjoyed the video, click on the subscribe button. Um, what stuff are you meant to say? Click to subscribe, like, comment, and subscribe. That's it. Yeah.
Yes,
In that order. You have to do it in that order, I think.
but you only have to subscribe once.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
we're going to be back next month, I think. We're going to do these
Mhm.
monthly. I chose
Mhm.
today's topic. It'll be Mark
Yeah.
choosing next month. And I still have no idea what that is. So, anyway,
Mhm.
we should look forward to that.
Fabulous.
Bye.